So welcome everybody to Scottsdale Behind the Photos. My name is Bruce Wall, and this is perhaps my favorite presentation. I have favorite tangents, but this class is just so much fun. It is a tangent. For this class, I am standing on the shoulders of giants, all the authors and historians who've come before me and who have done so many incredible things that made this class so much easier for me to do research. Joan Fadala, our community historian, our treasure of a community historian. She's written so many books and helped so much. Joanne Hanley, all her work for the Scottsdale Historical Society for years and years. Richard Lynch is literally the guy who wrote the book on Winfield Scott. We're going to talk about him later today. Patricia Myers McElfresh wrote the book Scottsdale Jewel of the Desert. It ended up solving a big question of who was in a picture we're going to see today. Lois McFarland was recently honored by the Scottsdale Public Library with a Spirit of, thank you, Spirit of Literacy Award. And she was a journalist for the Scottsdale Progress who documented much of Scottsdale's history as it happened. And we would never forget Paul Messenger, who not only wrote a great book about Scottsdale, about his memories, but he also writes the columns in the Arizona Republic, which I love to read. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to see a picture. We're going to talk about the photo for a minute, and then I'm going to tell you the background to the picture or some part about the picture. And it's going to be kind of like a game show. I'm going to ask you, what is some part of the photo? So let's look at this first picture. This is on the left is Winfield Scott. Sitting on the mule is Helen Scott. They are the Scots of Scottsdale. Winfield Scott was born in 1837 in West Novi, Michigan. And his family then moved to New York, and then he eventually came here. He bought the land from Indian School to Chaparral, from Scottsdale to Hayden, a square mile, 640 acres, for $2.50 an acre. And actually, he was overcharged because that was supposed to be land that had railroad access was supposed to be $2.50 an acre. He should have been $1.50 an acre. So he overpaid for it. It wasn't through his fault. And recently we celebrated Founders Day on Friday, and we actually had Winfield Scott came to the celebration at 185 years old. And he looked like me with a beard on for some reason. I don't know why. Well, anyways, let's take a look at this photo. It is the quintessential photo. This is so iconic of Scottsdale that this photo was turned into a statue that's in front of the Little Red Schoolhouse by Georgianne Tagnati about 2007-ish, 2001, something like that. So a couple things that you'll notice. Here's our pointer. You notice that Old Maud, the army mule, there's shadows coming off the feet, and there's shadow coming off of Winfield. So we know the sun has to be low, so it's most likely done at sunset. We know it's most likely in the winter because look, he's wearing a vest and a jacket. There's no way it's July when he and Helen were dressed like that. Amazing that Old Maud just stood still and didn't move around or didn't do anything at that exact moment. You notice we don't see any mountains in the background. There seemed to be a cloudy day and it's blocking the mountains, so we can't see, say, Camelback or the McDowells or the Four Peaks or something. But one of the things that always struck me about this photo, not that I'm some aficionado of photography composition, but you notice there's about a yard of space to the left of Winfield Scott, but on the right side, it's cut right at Old Maud's rear end. Does not continue. And if you look at the skirt on Helen, you might notice a shadow right there. So this brings me to the question of the game show portion of this one. Who was the shadow? Was it A, Orson Welles, the actor who played the shadow on the radio in 1937? You remember it started out, what evil lurks in the hearts of men? Only, wow, so do you. Look at you guys, that's awesome. Was it Reverend Judson Eliot, a colleague of Winfield Scott's who was convinced to move here at the end of his, not the end, but like in the mid part of his life. And he lived here for a number of years. And he actually opened up a tuberculosis sanitarium to help people because Phoenix wasn't allowing people with tuberculosis to move into Phoenix. So was that Reverend Judson Elliott? Did you see the shape of that huge mustache? That would be a cue. Or was it Werner Vanderhoff, a friend and mentee of Winfield Scott, much younger than either Elliott or Winfield Scott? Now, normally I would have you vote A, B, and C, and I would have you guys virtually typing in on the chat A, B, or C. But this was such a long time to figure out who was the shadow that I would rather explain to you for this one how we figured it out, and then we'll have you guys vote in the next pictures. So the first clue was Richard Lynch, the man who wrote the book Winfield Scott back in the mid-70s, about 1977. He did a video for Scottsdale Cable back in the 90s, and he showed the picture, and it wasn't quite as cut the way it is now. If you notice, if you look on this, you can see an arm and a leg sticking out. So we can know that somebody was there. It's not like the photographer. Someone was standing there. They've just been cut out of the picture for some reason. Then one day I was asking all these different people, do you know who the shadow is? Joanne Hanley, do you know who the shadow is? Joan Fadala, do you know who the shadow is? All these wonderful historians. And then Joan Fadala came back and she had a meeting in my building where I work. And she said, oh, Bruce, I found out who the shadow was. Who? That's incredible. Who's the shadow? So she showed me a picture she found in the Scottsdale Progress in 1976 that you can finally see. There is definitely a man on the right side. And at the bottom, it says it's Reverend V.A. Vanderhoff. So we know that the shadow is Reverend Vanderhoff. Now, why does that matter to us? Let me tell you that when I told my colleagues that it was Vanderhoff, they all said, again? Because this guy pops up into Scottsdale history so much, I started calling him Scottsdale's Where's Waldo? Because if you look at a lot of pictures, you'll find either him or one of his children in just about every iconic photo of Scottsdale, or many of them. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about Werner Vanderhoff. He was born in 1872 in Kansas. His parents were actually original, like not founders, but they moved in, they were pioneers of Kansas, some of the first to move there when it became a state in 1861. And he would have stayed there much longer, except he was diagnosed with most likely tuberculosis and told to go to a dry climate. So he came by train to Phoenix and, or Wagner, however he chose to get there, but he came to Phoenix and he went looking for a job and no one had a job for him. And finally, he heard a tip that some guy out in the Salt River Valley, because it wasn't called Scottsdale yet, some guy named Frank Titus was looking for someone to do some work for him. So he quickly went over there, and that's Frank Titus and his family, I believe. And that's certainly the Titus house. And if you go to the library, you can actually see there's stories by some of Vanderhoof's children. One of his daughters told that it was really hard to work for him. He was a wealthy railroad baron who made a lot of money. And when he said jump, he expected people to jump. So he would go into parties in Phoenix and he might come in at 12, 1 in the morning. He expected Vanderhoff to get up, not to be sleeping, and to deal with the horses. And even if it meant him staying up for the rest of the night, that was his job. He was like just a general helper. And he did it for about a year. And then he decided at the end of a year that he'd had enough, and he registered for Tempe Normal School, where he was going to become a teacher, because that's where you went to the normal school for, was to learn how to become a teacher. But before I tell you a little bit about this, let me show you about what that house looks like today. It's still standing in the same spot. It's one of the few homes that is still standing in the exact same spot at 1310 North Hayden Road. It's had a number of different owners. It's been private property the whole time. It keeps getting passed on from one owner to another since the 1890s when Titus built this house. But I did want to remind you of that. This is private property. This is not a museum. You can't knock on the door and expect to get a tour. This is somebody's personal house, and they're not going to invite you in if they don't know you. I say that because I was at a presentation Joan Fadala made, and some of the people who own it were there, and they said, yeah, people knock on our doors and ask for tours, and like, come on, it's our house. So no, they don't do that. So when Vanderhoff was at the Tempe Normal School, which you know today we would call, very good, Arizona State University, he ran into this woman who was also from Kansas, and that was Jane Martin. And they met and fell in love, and they got married. And you notice that Werner is sitting and Jane is standing. When Werner was a small boy, that earlier picture I showed with his sister, he was sitting. It seems to be a recurring thing. I guess he was very tall. So they get married and they become teachers and they move around. They did a little stuff at Cochise County. Then they moved back to the Salt River Valley, and they hang out essentially because of Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott is like a mentor to Werner, and he just thinks the world of Winfield Scott. And this is when he starts showing up in history over and over again. So let's go to 1901, the very first homicide in Scottsdale. It was a double homicide. The mailman, John Rubenstein, was trying to get his horse and wagon out of a paddock owned by Winfield Scott, and two of the hands were trying to fix this horse who slipped its bridle, and Rubenstein, the mailman, just walked up to both men and shot him in cold blood. No reason, no explanation. And this is an artist rendering, obviously, it's not a whole thing. And if you watch the Scoundrels, Rascals, and Cutthroats presentation, I go through the whole thing in 20 minutes to explain the whole murder and how it happened. But since there's no photo of it from 1901, I will tell you that's Werner Vanderhoff sitting on top of the wagon. Never got shot. He was fine. And he was the witness that told the authorities that John Rubenstein killed the two men in cold blood. So Rubenstein was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in the Yuma Territorial Prison. There's more to that story, but you have to watch the Scoundrels, Rascals, and Cutthroats presentation. So the first homicide, Werner is there. First marriage, this happens at the Underhill house. That's at the northwest corner of Indian School and Scottsdale Road. Today it's an office building, but it would be right across Scottsdale Road from Winfield Scott's house. And the Underhills, they knew, the husband knew that he was not able to do a lot of work. He had some tuberculosis or some sort of asthma problems. So he made this big, huge house with lots of rooms, and boarders would come and stay, like some of them would stay for the whole winter. So two of these people who did this, Walter Smith and Helen Green, while they were in Scottsdale, met, fell in love, and decided to get married in Scottsdale. They had this beautiful house as a background, and across the street is Chaplain Winfield Scott, and across the street from him is Judson Elliott. So there's all these ministers around. There's plenty of people that could conduct the wedding. So here's the first wedding in Scottsdale at the Underhill home in their little garden area. And I'll move so you can see the whole thing. Here's the bride and the groom. There's Winfield and Helen. And hiding, almost doing like a Kilroy is here, or was here. There in the corner is Werner and Jane Vanderhoff. But they're not the only ones. They brought their youngest child, or their oldest child, I'm sorry, May Vanderhoff. She was only about 2.5, 3 years old, right down there in the front. She's not even looking at the camera. So you got the Vanderhoff children now in on this act. The Vanderhoofs had 6 children in total, but 4 of them lived to adulthood. They were Perla May, who's the girl right here. And then the boy is James Werner. There, he's right here. And then Benjamin sitting on the lap, and down here is Mitty Jane. the cool thing about this was the Vanderhoof's lives are documented in the newspapers constantly. And at first I thought it was a coincidence, but then I was reading this. This is the News of Scottsdale from the Arizona Republican newspaper. Before it was the Arizona Republic, it became the Republic in the 30s. So this is before that. And Werner was the guy writing the stories about what was the news of Scottsdale. So that's why the Vanderhoofs are in it a lot. He didn't have to do a lot of research. So if you go down in this, you can see here's a story about Werner and his children. They also mentioned Chaplain Scott in this, and W. Hayden, Wilfred Hayden, who is the Hayden of Hayden Road, is mentioned in this. In 1910, when the state was trying to come up with a constitutional convention to become the state of Arizona, it was the territory of Arizona at the time, Vernon was elected to be a Maricopa County representative. And if you look in the fine print, there you see Werner Vander, a VA Vanderhoof, right there. And he's also mentioned over here as the Scottsdale representative at the Constitutional Convention for Arizona. In 1912, this iconoclast photo of the Little Red Schoolhouse showing the second generation of famous people in Scottsdale. For example, this person is E.O. Brown's son. That is Alvin Brown. And next to him on the horse, my mouse is not, oh, there we go. There, right here is Helen Hayden of Hayden Road, that Hayden's. And there are all these other people, one after another, are famous people. This guy wearing the sailor suit, that's Bill Miller, who's the son of Charles Miller, who's Miller Road. He's also, Charles Miller was also the person who gave the land that became Scottsdale High School. So this is Bill as a little boy. He said that he got made so much fun for wearing the sailor suit that he never wore it again after this photo. But you can also see here is James Vanderhoof, and there's May Vanderhoof holding the reins of the horse. So they're in this iconic photo. When the town was platted and recorded as Scottsdale in 1913, it had already been recorded in 1894, first as Orangedale in February, and then in August redone as Scottsdale. But it was platted with the streets, and you see, I don't know if you can see them, but the streets are Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, and Garfield, named after Civil War generals. But if you look at this a little bit closely, right there, VA Vanderhoof, and mentioned that here's the streets that we call them, Indian School Road, First Avenue, Main Street, and First Street. And Vanderhoof is also listed as being one of the Scottsdale School District trustees. In 1915, Vanderhoof became a coal porter, a missionary who sold Bibles to fund his missionary work. And the Baptists gave him this wagon and these horses, and he named one of the horses Matthew and the other was Luke. And he went around Arizona as a coal porter. But I did some digging recently, and I found that about 2 years after this, the Baptist Association decided to sell Matthew and Luke and the wagon because they wanted Werner to upgrade. So it was actually sold to Charles Miller, that's Miller Road guy. And so he got Matthew and Luke, but the Vanderhoofs took the wagon itself. And here was the upgrade. They got a car. In 1918, baptisms were done in little canals that were on the side. And this is actually kind of cool because you see this house in the background. That's Charles Miller's house, right at the corner of Indian School and Scottsdale Road. It's a Sears Craftsman home. And there's not a lot of Sears Craftsman home in Scottsdale, but at the time you ordered this as a kit from Sears Roebuck, and they told you, the first direction said, don't listen to all the people who try and tell you how to build this house. Follow our directions and you'll build it properly. Follow other people's directions to your own peril. So Charles apparently did not listen to other people. He built it his own way, or he built it the way it's supposed to be built. And that home has been moved to several places, but you can now see it off of First Street and Goldwater. And if you want to know where exactly, when you guys leave here, there's going to be a handout with the addresses and the locations of all the places that I've been talking about and will be talking about. So you'll be able to go and check that out. So the man that's sitting there doing the baptism, that is not Werner Vanderhoff. That's Reverend Pope from the Baptist Church in Scottsdale. Werner is that guy right there. Yeah. Yes, indeed, he's tall. So sometime later this year, after this baptism, Helen Scott had decided to get rid of the last of the land that she had after Winfield died in 1910, and she'd given away, she'd sold some, but she had a couple parcels left, and she decided she wanted to give one to Werner Vanderhoff and Jane, but the deal was they had to build the First Baptist Church of Scottsdale there. So here's the picture of their house that they built on Indian School and about Buckboard today. And next to it was the First Baptist Church of Scottsdale. Now today it would be called FBC Scottsdale, First Baptist Church Scottsdale, and it's located at 7025 East Osborne Road. Vernon retired in 1942 as a coal porter, but remained a minister and active in the church to his dying day. In fact, sometimes he keeps popping up. In the 1950s, they built Winfield Scott Junior High on the grounds of the Scottsdale High School, and they decided to do Founders Day, just like we did on Friday. So they decided they would bring in someone who knew Winfield Scott, who could talk about him in the 50s. Well, who would that be? There's really only one person to invite, and that would be V.A. Vanderhoff. Werner was the only one who knew Scott and was still alive. And here he is at Winfield Scott Junior High. In 1954, there was a funeral for a town councilman who was shot in his living room. There's a big scandal of the time. So it's rumored that the councilman was having an affair with his next door neighbor's wife. And the next door neighbor's wife was found drowned in the Arizona Canal at Scottsdale and Camelback about half an hour after he was found shot to death. So they immediately pinned the whole thing on the husband and had a whole long trial. I can't cover it in detail in Scoundrels, Rascals, and Cutthroats in about 20 minutes, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing there. But if you look at the funeral notice for funeral services on Saturday for Werner Frederick, he was known as Jim Frederick predominantly, but his real name was Vernon, Don Frederick. And Vernon was buried, so they got V.A. Vanderhoff was the man who went to bury him and to run the services. He and another Reverend John Davis was there with Reverend Vanderhoff. Vanderhoff died in 1960 at the age of 88, and considering that he moved here in 1892 because of his health, because he was told he would probably die if he didn't move to Scottsdale, I guess it worked. Here's his actual funeral notice. And it says that he had 4 children, more than 10 grandchildren, and many, many great-grandchildren. They didn't even try and count them all or list all their names. And he and Jane are buried at the Tempe Double Butte Cemetery, one of the 2 cemeteries where a lot of the pioneers of Scottsdale ended up. So Vanderhoff was a pioneer of Scottsdale, but there's nothing named after him. If you go to the FBC Scottsdale, there's a Winfield Scott Cafe or Winfield's Cafe, nothing about Werner Vanderhoff. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I first started to talk around in the building where I work. We started to have these new conference rooms, and I suggested we named one the Vanderhoff Conference Room, and that was shot down. So then I decided that I needed to find some way where I was going to be the person that was going to decide what the name of it was so that nobody could overrule me. Well, it turns out that one of the programs I run for Scottsdale is the Adopt a Row program, and I organized the employees in the building that I work to become a adopter group, and we have the area from Miller Road to Scottsdale Road along Indian School is our group. So we named it the Friends of V.A. Vanderhoof, and our sign says in memory of V.A. Vanderhoof and family. So there is something in Scottsdale with the Vanderhoof name. So I was thinking, how could we do this? Like, I'd like to sell merchandise. You know what the kids call merch? I want to sell stuff that would make it that people would say, what does that mean? And then you could tell the story. And then all these people could be telling the story of the Vanderhoofs and the early pioneers of Scottsdale. So the first thing I came up with was a t-shirt. And the t-shirt says, I saw the shadow. And then people would say, what does that mean? I saw the shadow. Well, you see the shadow in Helen Scott's skirt, and that's V.A. Vanderhoof, and I saw the shadow. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. So I proposed it to my supervisor, and she said, great idea, but we're not spending money on that. So we never did have it. I saw the shadow. But one of my colleagues said, Bruce, I don't wear t-shirts. Can you come up with a different idea? And I said, sure. I saw the shadow coffee mugs. I can come up with anything. I mean, it's a computer. I can put it on anything I want. So that is the story of a forgotten pioneer of Scottsdale. There are many more, unfortunately, that have been forgotten, but Werner, like I said, kept popping up, and that's why I called this section In Winfield's Shadow, because he seemed to pop up throughout the story of Scottsdale until the 1960s. Are there any questions? And that includes you virtual attendees. If you want to type in a question in the Q&A or the chat, Amy will read it to me and let you know. Anything in our in-person audience? Yes, sir.
Why did the Scots move to San Diego and pass away there?
Okay, so the question is, when and why did the Scots move to San Diego? Essentially, Helen Scott really didn't like the summers in Scottsdale, and there's no air conditioning when she lived here. So she was constantly trying to come up with reasons to get her and Winfield out in the summertime. So, for example, there were several years that Prescott needed a summer reverend in their Baptist church. So she would convince Winfield that they needed to go and spend the summer in Prescott, much more pleasant. Then their daughter, one of their oldest daughters, met and married an officer who eventually became a general. And that officer was in San Diego. He was stationed there. So that's what led Helen eventually to go to San Diego. And when Winfield died, they moved, she had him buried in San Diego. Yes. The comment was, can I also email out the document that has all the information? Absolutely. That's going to happen afterwards. You'll get an email probably later this afternoon. I've got to get back to my office and send that out to you guys. But absolutely, you guys will get the same thing that the people in our in-person audience gets. Any other questions? I was asked at the last presentation if any of the Vanderhoof children still live in Scottsdale, and the answer is no, they don't. Many of them ended up in California. And again, I have a feeling they were here so long ago, air conditioning wasn't around, that they eventually said, you know, let's go to a more temperate climate than dealing with the summers. Anything else? Okay, then let's turn the page on this one. And here's the question. What is that? Now, it appears to be a ladder leading down. It appears to be covered up in such a way that this was either been ignored for a long time, or it's made to be hidden. It's one or the other, because it certainly does not appear to be something that is used on a common basis. This appears to be either from disuse or hidden. So that leads us to the question of, what was that? Now, was it A, a tunnel used by prisoners of war to escape? B, the secret passageway between City Hall and the Civic Center Library? C, E.O. Brown's root cellar. Now, I know that that looks like CEO, But it's C, E.O. Brown's root cellar. E.O. Brown was one of our pioneers. Brown Avenue is named after him. The first general store was, he was the third owner of it. And he was like our Energizer Bunny who started many of the things of Scottsdale, like DC Ranch was started by E.O. Brown and Wilfred Hayden. He started the Ice Works. He was on and on. He was everywhere. So was it his root cellar? What do you guys think in person? A, B, or C? I'm hearing A and C. I'm not hearing anyone say B, the secret passageway. I'm a little hurt by that. No, I'm not really hurt at all. Amy, anything online? Okay. The correct answer is a tunnel used by prisoner of war to escape. Now, normally people say to me, what war was there a prisoner of war camp in Scottsdale? Well, welcome to World War II and Camp Papago Park in 1942 to 1946. In this presentation that I call Getting Away from It All. It'll make more sense in just a second. Here's another picture of the camp. Now, what they did for this camp, they first put Italian soldiers that were prisoners of war and they kept them there, but then they got this brilliant idea. Where could you put a U-boat sailor where having a knowledge of the sea would have no benefit whatsoever? Scottsdale. It's perfect. What are they going to do? They're not going to know anything. It's the desert. So where was this? On the left, this is Eric Fuller, the firefighter who is a firefighter historian for the Scottsdale Fire Department, shared with me this map. And then I put it on the right, a map. This is McDowell Road. This part, that's Oak. This is McDowell. This is the Phoenix baseball stadium where the Giants are going to practice. And then these are all homes in Scottsdale. This is Scottsdale, but this little sliver right here is Phoenix. So if you were to put this over top, that was the prisoner of war camp. And when they were building this, it was so difficult. All the ground around here was caliche, which is like cement times 1,000 for being so strong. They had to use dynamite to blast holes to put the different things in. So they said, no prisoner will ever be able to dig out of this camp. It'll never happen. This caliche is too strong. And that is true. And that was something the Army Corps of Engineers said. But what they forgot was if it's raining, caliche becomes just soft earth. And when it's dry, it's strong as cement, much stronger than cement. And this would have a problem in this presentation or in this portion of the story of the prisoner of war camp. One day, two of the soldiers found a map. They were named Heinrich Palmer and Reinhard Mark. They found a map of Arizona, and they were allowed to leave the camp, and they were allowed to work in the farmers' fields. And one of them found this map in a truck, and he snuck it away because what he saw there got him very excited. Blue lines. You know what blue lines mean on a map, right? Rivers. And what can you do on a river? You can float down in a boat. And these are sailors. So they could float down on the boat, down from Scottsdale all the way to Mexico and get to Germany, and they'd be free. It's brilliant. So they had to be put into this area. I've heard this story been called Hogan's Heroes in Reverse. It really wasn't. Everybody comes across like an idiot in this story. No one comes across looking too good. For whatever reason, the authorities in the camp decided that anyone who tried to break out of the camp would be put into one barrack. The problem with that was they were all there to talk together and make their plans. Not the best plan. Well, these guys did something just to get thrown into that barrack so that they could propose that. There was 2 or 3 captains, and one of them was like the most experienced captain. His name was Wattenberg. And these 2 guys wanted to go to Wattenberg and say, here's this map, let's use this to plan an escape. So they did, and they selected, well, what time of year would it be that people were in such a good mood, they might let their guard down a little bit? I know, Christmas. People might let down their guards at Christmas. They'll be with the feelings of Christmas and they might not be quite as strict. So they approached the camp and they said they wanted to build, and I apologize, I cannot pronounce things in German. That's not my area of expertise. But in one of the previous presentation, a lady said, this is as close as I can say to what she said. They wanted to build a Fußball court. That's as close as I can say. It looks like Fastball to me, but she pronounced it Fußball. Like there was some, I cannot do what she can do. But it's something sort of cross between soccer, volleyball. I've heard it described as both. And why they wanted to build this court was they needed a reason for all the earth they were going to dig underneath to dump it somewhere. So it was a perfect cover, and the camp gave them permission. So here's a sketch of what they did. They started in one area near their barracks that had like a spot where the guards couldn't see them from the guard towers. And they dug down and they said they weren't experts, they weren't engineers. It wasn't straight, it went up, it went down, it went sideways up. But it got essentially 178 feet from their barrack underneath the camp all the way to the cross-cut canal so that a person could crawl one at a time and get through. And they had a meeting and the captains decided that 25 of them would try and break out. And everyone else, they would stay, but they would cause a ruckus. Like, first off, they would, to cover the last sounds that night of December 23rd, 1944, when they were going to do the escape, they were going to organize everyone to sing Silent Night. And they did it so well that the guards joined in and sang with them and were actually helping them with the distraction so they couldn't hear. And the 25 men went in, 25 men came out, and they were out. And no one noticed for 2 days. The problem was that there had been some fights or arguments between the camp administration and the officers about doing roll calls. And they kept saying, we don't want to do the roll calls, we're officers. And the camp said, no, everyone has to do a roll call. And in this case, since the officers weren't there, they had already gone, they just didn't do the roll call for whatever reason, and it just didn't happen. So they didn't discover until Christmas Day. They did a roll call and discovered 25 were gone. And within a few hours of that, different prisoners started turning themselves in. It was raining, it was wet, they had no food, they didn't like it. Many of them escaped. It was a big deal, but not that big of a deal. Like, here's the newspaper, the Phoenix Gazette, and the story of them breaking out is on page 6. So it wasn't front page news yet. I guess enough escapes had happened already. And there were prisoner of war camps around Arizona and California, in other states, but never before had 25 of them broken out at one time. So this is the December 26, 1944 issue of the Phoenix Gazette. If you can see the fine print, I doubt it, it says $25 reward. Now, considering that a person could make $25 in a week, that's pretty good money. But it also says that it's $25 if you bring them back to the camp. If you call the military and have them bring it back, you only get $15 per person. So how far did they get? And the stories of some of them, one of the things that they did quite cleverly was they broke up and none of them went the biggest group is 3. Everybody else, they went in different directions, so it was harder for them to be caught. Several of them were found in Phoenix looking for food, searching for clothing to wear, so they didn't have their prisoner of war uniforms on. It's 6 enlisted men were victims of fate. Karl Frenzel had fallen into water and ruined the food for his group. And another group, they turned themselves into the authorities in Tempe. A motorist in West Tempe picked up a rain-soaked man carrying a backpack and asked for a ride to Phoenix and had a German accent. So he drove the guy directly to Maricopa County Sheriff's Office and turned him right in. So these two guys, this is Captain Hans Werner Krauss and Lieutenant Helmut Drescher, and they traveled on foot at night and they slept during the day. They made it 43 miles in a week until one night, Drescher tripped on some hole and broke his ankle. So he said, I can't go on. There's just no way I can keep walking. You go on, Captain, you go to freedom. We're probably only 100 miles from the border. You keep going. And the captain said, no, I'm not going to do this. We're going to turn ourselves in. So they walked over to a ranch house and they were going to turn themselves into the rancher. Unfortunately, the rancher and his wife were gone in Phoenix at the time. And they left their two young children and 12-year-old to look after the young children. So they turned themselves into a 12-year-old on December 31st, 1944. And the children hadn't seen chocolate since the war began, and they still had chocolate. So they offered chocolate to the kids. The kids made them coffee, and they sat around listening to the stories of submariners until the parents came back. When the parents came back, they came in with a newspaper that said 25 escaped, $25 reward for each. And they look at the pictures and they look at the two guys and they're like, $50, and we didn't have to do anything. They're sitting in our kitchen waiting for us. So these guys were driven back to the camp and the farmer got $50. Captain Fritz Guggenberger and Captain Jürgen Quatfalsam, they were captured by Indian scouts 15 miles from the Mexican border. They got down to there. You can see it right down by the Mexican border. One of the Indian scouts recognized Folsom because he had just caught him 11 months before in another escape that he was part of. So he definitely knew this guy. These two, Second Lieutenant Hans Zundorf and First Lieutenant Otto Hofreiter, on January 8, 1945, these two were arrested by soldiers from another prisoner of war camp in Florence that were out looking in Sassabee, Arizona, just north of the Mexican border. It was located right there. They were just about to cross into Mexico. That was the closest any group got. These three are kind of interesting. Lieutenant Krauss, Captain Gunther, and First Lieutenant Uzzolino, how can I put this diplomatically? They didn't want to walk at night and do all these things. They wanted it as easy as possible. So they had made some sort of raft that could fit through the tunnel, broken down into pieces. And then they assembled it together and they put it out in the Crosscut Canal and waited to be picked up and taken down to Mexico. And instead of the water picking them up and taking them away, the water went down and receded because the rain had fallen and it went down. And they realized they weren't going to get anywhere. So yeah, they definitely went with the work smarter, not harder philosophy. So it didn't work out. On January 8th, they were able to walk down as far as Gila Bend, and in the mighty Gila Bend River, which wasn't a river at all, they tried to set up their little kayak thingy again. It didn't work again. So Uzzolino decided that he would go and wash his clothes, and the other two said, don't go now, wait till it's dark. He went anyways, and he wandered into a party of searchers who then caught all three of them. These two were interesting. Walter Kozar and Johann Kremer. There's two different versions of what happened with them. The guy who wrote the book in the 90s about this said that Kremer was able to sneak in and out of the camp so often that he was able to feed Kozar and the captain, Wattenberg, the most senior captain, because they didn't go more than a mile away from the camp. Their philosophy was, they'll be looking all over Arizona. They won't look right near the camp. So we'll hide there in a cave. And apparently one day they decided to go down to a bowling alley in Phoenix and have some food. They thought with the bowling alley, they won't hear their thick accents with the noise of the balls hitting the pins. And they were right. No one figured out that they were Germans. And they ate their food and then they went back to their cave. So in one version, this Kremer was coming in and out, but Wattenberg himself said in a letter that was found after Hammond wrote the book, it said he didn't go in and out at will. One time he tried to sneak back in the camp because they were out of food and they had organized a place where the food was going to be as a drop if he couldn't get back out. And instead he got caught. And then the other one, Kozar, was caught waiting at the food drop to get the food. So they were caught, and this leaves just the captain is the last one. So they didn't get more than 1.5 miles away from the camp. So the last one, there was a story in the paper that said, we got to capture the last guy, the captain, the big shot. So on January 27th, more than a month since the escape, he decided he had enough money, he could stay at a hotel or get a nice meal. He couldn't do both. So he walked over to the Adams Hotel in downtown Phoenix and he said, could I get a room, please? And the guy behind the counter said essentially, no, we're not giving you a room. Why don't you go have a seat and you can try and see and get a room. We're already full up with soldiers. We're not giving rooms to anybody with a strong German accent like that. So he sits down, he reads the paper and he reads that they're still looking for him and that he's the big shot. So he decides he's going to walk to California. Again, he has no idea the distances involved. He's just going to, so he walks out. Here's Wattenberg. He walks out. This is about 1 a.m. And he runs into this guy. His name is Clarence Cherry, sorry. And he was the supervisor of the night crew that's cleaned up the streets of downtown Phoenix. And he walked up to Cherry and said, "Where is Van Buren Street?" And the guy looks at him and goes, "You're on Van Buren Street." "Oh, thank you." And he walks away. And he goes, that was a strong German accent. It just so happens that a police sergeant was walking by, a man named Sergeant Gilbert Brady. And he said, "Hey, Sarge, that guy, really strong German accent. You might want to go check him out." So Sergeant Brady goes over and says, "Excuse me, where are you from?" "Oh, I'm a rancher from Glendale." And Brady says, "Glendale, California or Glendale, Arizona?" And he says, "The one up back east." Well, he could have probably got away with 3 directions, but east was not the right one. And he said, "Show me your papers," and like the draft identification, he didn't have it because he was and he finally says, "I am the big shot. I am the one you are looking for." And so they were prominently featured in the newspaper. That's where I got those pictures. Now on page 1, a front page story about how they captured the last one, Captain Wattenberg. But there's still signs of this escape, and this whole time of the prisoner of war camp are all over the place if you know where to look. For example, this is the Elks Lodge on Oak and 64th Street. That was the officers' club of the prisoner of war camp. And that is the only Elks Club, according to their website, ever built from a former officers' club in a prisoner of war camp. But it's the same building. They've done some improvements, of course, over the last 70 plus years. If you wander near the baseball fields, you can actually see where they had the cement that was sunk in to make the posts for some of the watchtowers. And people have always asked me, what about those old white cabins? What happened to the cabins? Well, several of them were picked up and moved to a couple locations. They ended up at Scottsdale and Thomas, right behind where there's a McDonald's right now on the southwest corner. They were behind that, and they were rented out, not as short-term rentals. This is a long time ago. This was rented out as like for spring training or for anyone who wanted a place. And finally, they decided they wanted those areas to put homes up. So they wanted to get rid of the old barracks. And they put them up for sale. One person in Scottsdale bought one and put it on his property. Someone from Mesa took one. And then the last two, nobody wanted. So the Tempe Historic Society all pitched in $8,000 and they bought it and had to move to the Tempe Corporation Yard where their public works offices are. And they still are there to this day. I'm sure the employees have no idea that those are World War II vintage cabins. So now a little side story, my little tangent. So I'm looking at this map one day and I noticed something sort of caught my eye. I'll make this a little bit bigger. You might be able to see it. If we zoom into this area right there, it says Papago POW Escape Monument. I thought, what does that mean? So the person I was working with, some of you know Jamie I used to work with, I said, Jamie, we're going on an expedition. We're going to go find out what an escape monument is. So off we went down. Oh, I should show you. We went down 64th Street to Oak. We parked the car over here, and then we started walking down the Crosscut Canal to go to this. And this was June, so it was hot. It was not a pleasant time to be doing this, but when I get on these little kicks, we do these things. So we're walking down, and I see on the right-hand side this manhole cover, and I'm saying to Jamie, where is this thing? This is the craziest thing. Why? And it's not even dawning on me. And Jamie starts saying, it's right there. I said, what's there? There. What? The manhole cover. The manhole cover? Why would they put a manhole cover next to a canal? You're not going to go down into the. And that's when it all dawned on me, and I looked at it, and there is the monument. That is the location, they said, that where the prisoners came out of their tunnel. Right there. Let me zoom into it. It was actually funny. Last time I did this class in 2019, the year of this said 1943. So I called up the city and I said, hey, 1943, let's try 1944. He said, we already know, we've already contacted. They're just waiting to get the numbers. And so this has now been corrected. It now says 1944 on it. There are so many things that you can see about the prisoner of war camp. For example, Desert Run is a fiction book about a fictional character, a fictional detective, who's a former Scottsdale police officer who solves crimes. And Betty Webb, the author, was a reporter in town. So many of her things that she covered, Lena Jones, the detective, solves these things. And it's also really cool because she'll say, oh, the early person who was reading the books on MP3 didn't know Arizona pronunciation. So she says things like the saguaros and the cholla cactuses. And then finally they got a better person who could pronounce the names of things. But she'll talk about, oh, so I drove down Scottsdale Road and I stopped at this restaurant, and you go, oh, I know that restaurant. Or it was, in fact, in one of them, even the Poison Pen bookstore is in one of the Betty Webb. So if you never heard of anything, Betty Webb and the whole, they're all called Desert something, Desert Run, Desert Fox, Desert whatever. But this is all set up, a fictitious thing about a fictitious captain who moved back from World War II. He moved to Scottsdale and then he gets murdered, and Lena Jones solves it. The Swastika Tattoo is another fiction. It's about a soldier or one of the prisoners of war who goes to work for at a farm, and the farmer is Jewish, and they actually first fight and then they become friends, which causes problems for the prisoner of war because some of the people, well, I won't tip off the book. You'll have to read it to find out. The Fastball Tunnel, that's the one by Hammond where he tells the whole story of the break of the escape. PW, the one on the far right, stands for prisoner of war. That's by Steve Hoza. Steve Hoza still does presentations about the prisoner of war camp. He doesn't think that the escape man is a big deal. He thinks there's many other cool things about the camp that he would rather talk about. But in this book written in the 90s, he went back and interviewed everyone he could find who was still alive. The guards, the prisoners, everyone he could find, the townspeople, and he tells their stories. And it's like a good little snapshot. I saw this for sale about 4 years ago on eBay, and they wanted $175, and I decided I don't want it that much. So instead, the library has a copy, and you're not allowed to take it out. You have to go there and read it. So I sat there and read it in a couple of hours. It's only like 40, 50 pages. It wasn't that big of a deal, but it's an interesting read. And I don't think I would have spent $175 if it was offered again. It happens in Arizona, has the whole story of the prisoner of war camp as one of the chapters. Death at a Papago prisoner of war camp. That was another thing that happened at the camp where they had a guy a German prisoner who was collaborating with the Americans. They were moving him from camp to camp to give information. And when they got him to Camp Papago, one of the prisoners recognized him from another camp and realized that he was the snitch who caused them to have their problems. So they told the captains, and that prisoner was killed by the prisoners. And it's a big story of this, and that's by Joan Eppinga, the historian. My favorite book in this whole series is The Great Desert Escape by Keith Warren Lloyd. If any of you were around right at the beginning of the pandemic, we had Keith Warren Lloyd do a presentation about it. He knows more about this than anybody I've seen about he explained things I'd never heard before. Absolutely fascinating presentation. And that's recorded. And if you go to the Scottsdale Neighborhood College page, you can watch his presentation of The Great Desert Escape. And his book is like a great accounting of the whole story. And the last thing, there's a podcast, The Valley 101 by AZ Central, did a whole story on the prisoner of war camp, and they interviewed Steve Hosler, the guy who wrote that book in the top right-hand corner. So you can definitely see a lot about the camp, as well as the actual physical things you can see. So let's see about some Camp Papago merch. What do you guys think of this? Hiding in plain sight, Camp Papago, Arizona. Or when you need to escape, visit Scottsdale. I like the mug. I actually think that's one of my favorite of the whole presentation. Are there any questions about this? And any questions in virtual? Okay. Yes. Okay, so the question is, the monument that I showed, the picture of where they came up, is that where it's actually the opposite end of the tunnel. The very first picture that shows the opened up hatch and the ladder going down, that was found in the prisoner of war camp, and they came up over by the Crosscut Canal, and that's where they put that little monument.
Okay, so this was going down.
Right, that one was to go down, and this one was to come up on the other side. Yeah.
So,
You would ruin public art. The question was, if you lifted up the manhole cover, would anything be there? No, but you remind me of a funny story. One of the old planners told me that one day these people were sitting in their family room and they heard this thunderous sound, like boom, and they walked out and their whole backyard had caved in. It turned out this was where the tunnel was. And when they filled it in from both sides, they didn't get the middle. And these people's home just collapsed. They're not their home, their backyard just collapsed into this tunnel. And the city actually fixed it for them because they had no idea they were on this whole thing. So, but the planning department actually went out and surveyed it and did it all and fixed it so it would never collapse again. So if you live out there, you're fine. Don't worry about it. Anything else? Okay, and we're going to turn the page on that one. And let's look at this picture. If you want a good clue for what street this is, look at the top right and you'll see Scottsdale. So that's most likely Scottsdale Road. And the other big clue on this one is the cowboy right there. The cowboy is located, anyone? Bueller at Scottsdale in Maine. So if we know that's Scottsdale and that's Maine, then this leads me to the question, this striped building right here, what is the name of that restaurant? Is it A, the Sugar Bowl, B, the Lulabelle, or C, Dale Anderson's other place? I heard several people shout the answer out. I'm hearing a lot of B's. And some people say A, that usually happens. So if you go back and look at that, if Scottsdale Road is going this way and this is Main Street, then this would not be the Sugar Bowl because the Sugar Bowl would be over on First and Scottsdale Road. So this could only be the Lulabelle. Dale Anderson's other place was down on Scottsdale and Lincoln. So let me show you a different angle of that picture. And another interesting thing, you see that this, where this gas station is, that used to be, that today would be Gilbert Ortega's gift shop right on Scottsdale in Maine. And the Lulabelle, you can see the sign right next to it. And this is Jim Frederick's Auto Livery Stable. Jim Fredericks was that, was the town councilman who got shot in his family room that Werner Vanderhoff did his funeral as running this thing. So we know that this is before 1954 because Jim Fredericks is still alive because it's his auto livery stable. So we kind of can date it there. You can also look over here. That's the original location of the Pink Pony right on Main Street and Scottsdale Road before they had to move a couple doors down to where we think of them on Scottsdale Road before it closed. But right next to the Pink Pony is the Bank of Douglas. And on top of the Bank of Douglas, of course, you would put a wagon. I have no idea why, but they did. And the Bank of Douglas eventually became the Arizona Bank. And now I have no idea what the Arizona Bank, maybe the Bank of America. There's so many mergers and acquisitions. Who knows what the Arizona Bank became? But I remember moving here in the 80s that it was the Arizona Bank and Valley National Bank were the two major banks in the 80s. So you see the wagon on the top of the Bank of Douglas. The Bank of Douglas must change location. It's gone. But the funniest thing is that wagon's going to show up again later on. The manager of the Lulabelle was Dale Anderson. That's a young picture of Dale Anderson. He was born in 1923, he died in 2009. He was one of the first managers of the Lulabelle and kind of learned his skills there. And then he opened up Dale Anderson's restaurant, the other place, the Anderson House, the Quilted Bear, and many more. One day on the Prado del Sol, someone took a color photo of the Lulabelle. And that's kind of cool. You don't see a lot of colored pictures back then because colored film was so expensive. But please notice the wagon is on the roof. Now, if you've been around the valley for any length of time, you know there's Coulter Cadillac, and their thing is always look for the car on the roof. But my favorite was when Tom Brenneman, the first voice of the Arizona Diamondbacks, did it in the 90s and late and 2000s until he moved to Cincinnati to work with his father. But he would say, look for the car on the roof. And he had that great voice. And by the way, he lived in Scottsdale. So anyways, this is the restaurant that put the wagon on the roof for some reason. Here's another picture of it in the 50s. You see the cowboy sitting with a Stetson, you know, just looking down the street. And there's the Lulabelle on Main Street. And of course, there's the wagon on the roof. Here's a rare inside picture. And I was doing this presentation for someone and they put up their hand and they said that their first job when they were 16 was being a busboy at the Lulabelle. And on Saturday night, a famous actress claimed a table and it was her table on Saturday night. That was a table right there. And that was Miss Kitty from Gunsmoke. She lived in the area and she ate at the Lulabelle on Saturday nights, and that was her table. She was also the Prado del Sol Grand Marshal one year, on and on. Here's some pictures. Their theme was what they called the gay 90s, as in the 1890s of Western. And these are employees and customers who would get dressed up in the costumes. Here's another picture that I kind of love. It's so obviously staged, as if, you just happen to be driving in your convertible and you happen to run into the marshal. So you ask a question to the marshal and you happen to be in front of the Lulabelle. This is so staged, but okay. Apparently, we're supposed to believe that this can just happen every day in Scottsdale. And you can also still notice the wagon is on the roof. Now, the owners of this, there was a group of people, but one of the people that were very well known were the Foles. And the Foles also partnered with another person, and they opened the Valley Ho with John Mills. And this is Bobby and Evelyn Foles. They opened it in December 20th, 1956. They had the Valley Ho, and there was like sister properties. If you were at the Valley Ho, they'd say, hey, you should go and have dinner at the Lulabelle. If you're at the Lulabelle, hey, you should be staying at the Valley Ho, kind of cross-pollinating or cross-marketing. And many people, famous people, started showing up at both the Valley Ho and the Lulabelle. And there's some pictures from them. Here's a great photo from the wedding of Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner. I was doing this presentation for some younger people, and I said, Robert Wagner, and they're like, who? So I bet you've seen a movie with Robert Wagner. I'm like, if you say so. I said, okay. Ever seen Austin Powers? Yeah. Yeah, they're on TV all the time, right? You remember Dr. Evil had a henchman named Number 2? Well, that was Robert Wagner, as a much older man than this picture. And the younger Number 2 was played by Rob Lowe. So he was that generation's Rob Lowe in a way. And people, they go, oh, okay, I actually know who that is then. I know who Number 2 from Austin Powers. So they had their wedding at a church in Old Town, and then they came to the Valley Ho for their reception. There was a time that Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh, they were doing a movie in Phoenix, and they stayed at the Valley Ho for over a month. So the people of Scottsdale ran into them into town, at the restaurant, at the hotels, everything. And here they are with Bobby and Evelyn Foles. Here's a picture with Bing Crosby with Bobby Foles. So to kind of cut to the chase, since I don't want to show you picture after picture, some other stars that would stay at the Valley Ho included James Cagney, Rudy Valley, Betty Davis, Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman, Marilyn Monroe, and Jimmy Durante. In fact, Jimmy Durante would walk up into the piano in the lounge unannounced and just start playing the piano. And I always think of, as a kid, I remember that impersonation Rich Little used to do. That's my boy, ha-cha-cha-cha-cha, for Jimmy Durante. That was my Jimmy Durante. Thank you very much, please. Well, it turns out that Bobby Foles didn't realize that the famous people have been hanging out at the Lulabelle for much longer than he had any idea. This is the original owner of the building in 1920. It was Lillian and Marshall Kubelski. They were the first that I have been able to find, first Jewish family that lived in Scottsdale. And they owned this business, which they called the Boston Store. And it was groceries and home furnishings and whatever else you need, sort of like a mini Walmart in one store. And people have asked me, right down here it says abarrot, and that's actually a misspelling of the Spanish word for groceries, abarrot. So they missed an R, but that's again to tell that there's groceries there. It both says in English up above and down below. And the person sitting right there, that is actually Marshall Kubelski. And Marshall Kubelski's first cousin was Benjamin Kubelski, and he would come and visit whenever he was in Phoenix or in the area. And sometimes he'd stay with him for a week or so, just in the wintertime, beautiful climate of Scottsdale. And so Benjamin would hang out quite often. Eventually, the Kubelskis sold in about 1926 after Marshall's I think his baseball career must have ended. He was also an amateur baseball player, and he played for the Scottsdale team in the 20s. He then moved out to Levine after that. But you may know Benjamin Kubelski by his stage name. That would be, of course, Jack Benny. So Jack Benny used to come here in the 20s and as a younger man and hang out. Now, before the pandemic, I used to show this as the photo of what the Lulabelle looks now with the Gilbert Ortegas, and then it was Dave's Hamburgers, and then there would be a little gift shop next to it. But unfortunately, Dave's Hamburgers did not survive the pandemic for very long at all. I don't even know if it was before the pandemic, it was gone. And if you were to look at that, it was a great diner. I love diner food, it's a bad habit, but fun to eat at. And I used to, when I was working for the police department, I would take some of the younger officers to go and have lunch with me. And I say, hey, we're gonna have diner food. And they would usually go with me even if I paid. So they did. But today it's called Bell's Nashville Kitchen. And the Bell is a tribute to the Lulabelle, giving a partial name. And now there's Voila Boutique right next door. And this photo was taken actually yesterday. So I know this is accurate in the last 24 hours. If you want to see some more signs of Lulabelles, if you go to this business right here called Scottsdale Southwest Gifts, and you walk inside and walk down to the end, you will see a tribute to the Lulabelle painted on the wall. And there's also this poster. Now they have this one's from 2019. When I went in yesterday, they have this laminated, framed, it's incredible. It looks like a lithograph, and they want $1,300 for it. These posters you can get for $9.99 if you really want a Lulabelle Saloon poster. Or you could get the $1,300. I'm sure they'd be happy to take it. So let's talk about some Lulabelle merch. How about the t-shirt that says "The Place to Be Seen" in Scottsdale, Arizona? Or the coffee mug version, "Go to the restaurant with a wagon on the roof." Are there any questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you ever mentioned that the street where Lulabelle's is also, I believe, had 2 pornographic theaters on it. Did you ever bring that up?
You know, it's funny, someone brings it up on almost every presentation. So you're today's presentation. So across the street from the Lulabelle, in 1947-ish, the first mayor of Scottsdale, Malcolm White, built the T-Bar T movie theater. It was the first movie theater in Scottsdale. I, in fact, forgot to tell you a great Paul Messenger story about him as a kid wanting to go to movies, and you'd have to go all the way to Phoenix. But at the Papago prisoner of war camp during the war, they showed movies to the prisoners, and he and his friend would sneak in because his friend's father was the projectionist at the camp. So that was, Paul Messenger tells these stories about him going to movies. So the first official movie was the T-Bar T. Another owner bought it. The third owner turned it into the Kiva, and it was a adult movie theater. And I don't think there were many tears shed when it went out of business. Prior to the pandemic, it was an Australian bakery. And now it's some sort of women's something, fashions. I don't know. And then the other one, I can't think of the name. Portofino. Someone always remembers the name of that. Is the Portofino, and that was another one. And tell me where it was located.
Right across the street,
Right?
practically.
Okay. On the other side of Main Street.
They have all weird things.
Okay.
We're very open.
I guess. So the comment was that the Portofino was across the street of the Tea Party, which became the Kiva, and so we had 2 adult theaters in Old Town. And again, no tears were shed when either one of those theaters closed. Any other questions? Virtually? I was asked at the last presentation, why were famous people attracted to Scottsdale? They could get here very quickly by plane in about an hour, and the paparazzi, the media, never followed them. So if they did things, they could be like regular people in Scottsdale, and they can go to restaurants and without being chased and their pictures taken and end up in the LA gossip column. So they really liked Scottsdale. It was a very frequent place for them to go to. Okay. We're coming up to the indomitable woman of Scottsdale. Now, this picture shows a group. Is this a group of citizens? Is this a group of actors? We know that there are 5 people wearing police uniforms or a sort of a sheriff, marshal kind of uniform, and 12 people that are in plain civilian clothes. There's a bunch of cigarettes in cigarette ashtrays, and they have pieces of paper in front of them. So, who is this august group of Scottsdale citizens? Is it A, the Scottsdale Theater Company original players in costume? B, the jury and deputies who protected them after a Scottsdale court case? Or C, the council employees of the town of Scottsdale? What do you guys think? Either you all are agreeing with me in Spanish and saying C, or you think C because I heard nothing else. How about virtually? Did anybody chime in? Okay. The correct answer is C. Now, I don't want you to think this is the entire population or the entire number of employees. 3 people were missing. There was 20 people working for the city of Scottsdale. And so these 5 guys in the back, they were the Scottsdale Marshal's office. This guy with the dark hat, that's Red Cooper. He was the marshal who was the second marshal. And he's the one who chose the 6-pointed star that the Scottsdale Police Department still uses to this day. This guy next to him right here, that's Ken Pepper. And Ken Pepper in the Scoundrels class was the one who arrested a famous person for a DUI in the 50s. This person right over here is Mort Kimsey. He was the 2nd mayor of Scottsdale. He's the mayor at the time of this photo. That's E.G. Scott. He was one of the early blacksmiths, and he was one of the original town councilmen. That is Bill Schrader. He became the mayor after Mort Kimsey. But I want to talk about there's only one woman at the table, and that's Dorothy Cavalier. She's not the only Cavalier at the table. Right next to her, or not next to her, in the same table, that's George Cavalier. So there's 2 Cavaliers at this table. George was a councilman, and Dorothy was the town and this time city clerk for the city of Scottsdale. So to track back the family of the Cavaliers, let's go back to 1909. George and Mary Cavalier moved from California when George's brother tells him that there's a job in Phoenix if he will stop and he'll come here and follow the dredge that is digging and redigging the Arizona Canal. If he'll fix it and keep it working, there's work for him for about a year. So he moves to Arizona, and he's a big, strong guy, and he's really good with tools. So he does this, and that's his wife, Mary, on the right. And here's a couple pictures. That's the dredge in the background. They're all dressed up in their Sunday best. They're going into town for something. And that's their little daughter, Alice, the oldest child. And like, as a youngest child, I can tell you there's more pictures of oldest children than any other child in a family. So here's little Alice in the buggy going to town. On the right, little Alice sitting with her mom in front of their house. Now, their house was called a sled house. The house had to move, so they followed the dredge. So it was built on these planks, and they would have horses pull the house as it moved to keep up with the dredge. So in effect, the Cavaliers owned the first mobile home in Scottsdale. After they finished the work, George decided that he wanted to be a blacksmith full-time, and he picked Scottsdale. So his first location he wanted was right on the corner where I just showed you where the Pink Pony was, on Scottsdale and Main Street, on the southeast corner. And then he says to the town elders, I want to build this, I want to build a blacksmith shop on Main Street. And they say, no. We're not going to let you build a dirty, smelly blacksmith shop on Main Street. you got to put it way out in the boonies. You got to go to 2nd Street. So that's where he does. Here's his first blacksmith shop. You notice it has a roof, but no walls. And that's Camelback Mountain in the background. There's nothing from 2nd Street to obstruct the view between 2nd Street all the way to Camelback Mountain. It's just farmers' fields. And that's him holding, of course, baby Alice, because she's got to be in every picture, or so it seems. His second blacksmith shop that he built had walls, but no roof. Now think about this. This man must have been tough as nails because he was working a blast furnace in the summertime in Scottsdale without a roof. Tough as nails. Eventually, he did build a roof, and I asked his grandson, George, who still runs the blacksmith shop, I said, why did it take so long for your grandfather to build the roof? And he said, well, you see this area where I now have the forge? I said, yeah, I see it. He said, well, my granddad he knew times were tough back then. So sometimes he set up a boxing ring, and sometimes he would bring people in over from Phoenix to box and wrestle, and he'd charge them 5 cents. And that sometimes those Saturday nights would be enough to keep him through, get him economically through a tough month. And one day he was doing this, and there weren't a lot of people who were paying, but when the boxer knocked down the other boxer, he heard this loud applause, and he thought, there's not enough people to make this noise. And he looked up, and in trees were all these people watching. And that's when he decided to put the roof on top of the blacksmith shop. Dorothy literally grew up next to the blacksmith shop, and she was literally born in Scottsdale because there was no hospital. And when her mother had her, she had her in the house behind the blacksmith shop. Here's a picture of Dorothy, and there's George in not the Little Red Schoolhouse. Let me get this out of the way so you can see it. This is the annex building. When the Little Red Schoolhouse, they had too many kids, so they built another building next to it called the annex. And this is Dorothy and George, the son of the father, going to school at the Little Red Schoolhouse annex. I was just going to say that they graduated from high school in 1933. So you can guess it's somewhere in the 20s that this picture was taken. In 1936, she marries Glenn Ketchum. And they have this photo. And I've always asked the Cavaliers, okay, we know from photos that that's Dorothy, but which one is Glenn? Some people say, well, this guy's got a pocket square and a boutonniere, so maybe that's Glenn, or it could be him because don't know. Maybe one of the Cavaliers can answer that question, but this is a newspaper article from 1936. In the 1950s, the marriage with Glenn didn't work out. They did have a couple children, but it didn't work out with Glenn. Glenn moved out of town, and Dorothy remained as a single mom in the 40s and 50s and 60s. She does marry again, but for a long time, she was a single mom living here. And she got very involved with the blacksmith shop, trying to help them, and she did different jobs. And eventually, she got hired as the town clerk. But before she did this, one day a group of her friends were sitting in, they were sitting at, I think it's at Lute's Scottsdale Pharmacy on Scottsdale Road, and they were trying to brainstorm some way to get tourists to come to Scottsdale in November. And they came up with the idea of having a parade, and they called it the Sunshine Festival. So in 1951 and 1952, they had the Sunshine Festival in Scottsdale. And this is 1953, the very first parade where the locals decided to give it to the Scottsdale JCs to run, and they rename it the Parada del Sol, the Parade of the Sun. But they kept the idea that it's all horseback, no motorized vehicles for the Parada. So here's Dorothy on her championship horse, Golden Nugget, and behind her to the right, that is not a building, that is the Cavalier float that went through many, many years up into the 60s and 70s in the Parada del Sol. Dorothy is hired to be the town clerk. She's the second town clerk and first city clerk of Scottsdale. Here she is sitting at the table where they were meeting. This is, that's Malcolm White, the first mayor of Scottsdale, the guy who opened the T-Bar Tea. That's Mort Kimsey, the second mayor, E.G. Scott, the blacksmith. That's Paul Messenger's brother, who was the city attorney. And standing next or sitting at the table, I think George Cavalier, the son, had that thing where you flash photography and his eyes closed, because you notice in all these photos, his eyes are always closed. But in the daylight photos, his eyes aren't closed. So I think he just one of those people that the flash went and their eyes closed. But Dorothy doesn't seem to have that problem. So here she's a clerk. And so she's a single mom with children working for the city. And she's running the city essentially with all the city funds in a cigar box. That's all that she needed, really. There was no security needed. Until this is June 22nd, 1963, a little controversy happens. Dorothy's in her office at City Hall, and the phone rings. She picks it up, says City of Scottsdale, city clerk. And the person says, yes, can you tell me what time the council meeting is tonight? I see it in the paper, but it doesn't say the time. And Dorothy says, oh, no. There's no council meeting tonight. I'm the city clerk. For there to be a council meeting, I have to be there as the clerk. Since I don't know about it, there's no council meeting. And the lady on the phone says, no, I'm looking at the paper. It says there's a meeting, but it doesn't say the time. And Dorothy says, well, it's wrong. It can't be happening. So she hangs up the phone, she opens up the paper, and there it says that the city of Scottsdale is having a meeting. So she goes over to the city manager, and he's an acting city manager. The acting city manager is acting because the last one was involved in land fraud that Dorothy caught and forced him to resign, and then he got charged with land fraud. So Dorothy goes over to the acting city manager and says, you got to tell me when there's meetings. I have to be there by city charter. I have to be present at all meetings. And she's absolutely right. The clerk and the manager have to be at all city meetings, at least to be notified of them. It couldn't be a surprise. And there was a reporter who wrote this whole story about overhearing the whole exchange between Dorothy and the acting city manager. Well, the council did not like that Dorothy was yelling at the poor city manager. So they said, Dorothy, you need to apologize. So she went to the city manager and said, I'm really sorry if the council is upset. And they said, wait, Dorothy, that's not an apology. You need to apologize for yelling at me. And she said, I haven't done anything wrong. I am right. The clerk has to be at a meeting. I should have been notified. I've done nothing wrong. So it goes back and forth, and finally, the council decides to have a meeting and decide the fate of Dorothy. Should they fire her? Should they keep her? And Dorothy is she's not politically naive. It just so happens at this meeting, 150 of her friends and the friends of the Cavalier family show up holding signs and protesting the meeting. So here's the picture of the next day. The council decides to fire her. There's a couple signs there. One of them says, let me get this back so I can see. One of them says, down with dictator Schrader and his yes men council. The mayor at the time was Bill Schrader. And the other one says, over here, says, all we want is a fair shake for Dorothy. That's a guess. It's really hard to read that sign. She was fired. The next day, they send a reporter to see her and say, how are you feeling? She says, I feel wonderful. I feel like a burden has been lifted off my shoulders. I'm much happier now that I'm no longer the clerk because I was right and there was no reason for me to resign. Well, then the council starts finding out that some people in town are saying she should run for mayor. So they realized the grounds for this, the council fired her and never even acknowledged that she worked for the city for 10 years. So they quickly had a plaque made up and they presented Dorothy with a plaque of 10 years of service to the city of Scottsdale, the town and city. When she was fired, she went to work for her brother, George, the second one, who also had businesses running Riata Pass and Greasewood Flats. So she had a job for essentially as long as she wanted to. On the 50th anniversary of the Parada del Sol in 2003, they had Dorothy as the Grand Marshal, and they had a picture in the paper showing Dorothy, that original picture of Golden Nugget, the horse, and what Dorothy looks like now, and saying that she was the Grand Marshal. She couldn't be on a horse like that. She was in a little buggy. And then 50 years after she was fired, they had a story about, she's actually holding the plaque that she got for her 10 years of service to the city. And she tells the story. And they interviewed Bill Schrader, and he says, you know, it was just a difference of opinion of how things go. There's no hard feelings. And it just something that the council felt strongly about, and Dorothy had a different opinion, so they felt it was better to split their separate ways. Dorothy lived till she was 90 years old. The time she died, they said she was the oldest person born in Scottsdale. And she kept that for a little while. That was May 4th, 2005. And if you ever want to read a little bit more about the Cavaliers, George Cavalier dictated a book, and they threw in photos, and it's called 100 Years of the Cavaliers. I've only found it at one place, and I have not found it. I have not been there since the pandemic to see. It was at the Museum of the West gift shop. That's where I bought my copy of it. So. One thing I did not mention, let me just go back for 1 second. The picture of Dorothy right there, what I love about that is you can tell just the look in her face and the way she's holding the microphone. She's not meekly going, oh, gee, oh my, what are you guys going to do? She's giving them a piece of her mind. You can tell she's as tough as her old man. She was not taking anything from anybody. I love that picture. I meant to say that at the time. So let's go to our merchandise, and it'll make a little bit more sense. The Cavaliers, tough as nails in Scottsdale since 1910. Or the mug, don't mess with Dorothy Cavalier. Are there any questions about Dorothy? Yeah.
Is the Cavalier business still doing business with the public? Are they open for welding?
Definitely prior to the pandemic, they were, and they were doing demonstrations on Saturdays from 1 to 4, where the Cavaliers would dress up in the old clothes of his grandfather, and he would do stuff. They have all the original tools that his grandfather and father used, and he would do demonstrations and he would make stuff. And they still take contracts from what I've heard, but they're not doing the demonstrations anymore, I guess, since the pandemic, it kind of ended. But I'll tell you, if you can go there and they are there, the coolest thing you can do, this little Scottsdale behind the story, is ask his wife if you can go for a tour of the museum. Call it the museum because that's what George calls it. She calls it the junk room. She will take you for this tour, and she will point out things, and you go, oh my gosh, why do you have this stuff? This is incredible. Like motorcycles from the 40s. And one of the strangest things was part of the jail cell from the Scottsdale's original jail, like the urinal and things. Like, why did you keep this stuff? And they have the sign hanging up that was the original Scottsdale street sign still hanging up in the blacksmith shop. So if you can do that, it is so cool to see all this stuff. The TV show American Pickers would probably spend a month in that place. So yes, from what I've heard, it is still open for business, and they are still taking contracts to build different things. Any other questions? Okay, we're going to the last story. We're at the finale here. And this is obviously a police car because it says right there, police. And we also know, if you've been into Old Town, you know that that's in front of the library. So we know that Scottsdale, and there's also a Scottsdale emblem on the side of it, right over here. So this is a Scottsdale police car. So the question is, Was this vehicle A, a DeLorean, B, a Bricklin, or C, an Opel? Wow, you guys are good. It is a Bricklin SV1. And to hear about the story of how the Bricklin came to Scottsdale, let's go back to talk about this man right here. His name is Malcolm Bricklin. And in 1968, he teamed up with the guy to the left of him, Harvey Lamb, and they formed the California Subaru dealership. And he was the man who brought the Subaru car to the US market. They were young and inexperienced, and they had no knowledge of car sales, but they made a fortune on the Subaru. The Subaru was interesting at the time. This vehicle had 25 horsepower. I didn't mispronounce that. 25 horsepower. The only car that this one was known to beat in a race, Fred Flintstone's, with foot power, because what else could that car beat? A bicycle would probably be a challenge. So here's Malcolm Bricklin. He partnered with this guy right over here, Richard Hatch. He was the premier of the province of New Brunswick. So New Brunswick, Canada is a province which is like a state, and a premier is like a governor. And this premier said, if you build your car in my province, I'll give you $23 million to build it. And so he said yes, and he did it. Now, if you want to know where that is in terms of Canada, there it is down here. This is the province of New Brunswick. It's just above Maine. And if you're going to design this great car, you need a great designer. So they hired Herb Grassi. Now, he was most known as an associate designer for George Barris. And George Barris is kind of well known. You've probably heard of him, even if you don't realize you've heard of him, because George Barris is considered the designer and Herb Grassi is the associate designer of the Batmobile. And the Batmobile was sold at auction in 2013 during the recession at the Barrett-Jackson Auto Auction. And it sold for $4.6 million. Here's a picture of Barris with the car. He died in 2015 at age 89. So Grassi came up with this idea of this car. Sleek, gull-wing doors. One of the first cars to have gull-wing doors, and that became kind of a sports car icon. And they used hydraulics to open it, which was a brilliant idea when you think about it, unless the battery failed. But it was a nice little car. It had very sporty lines. People liked the look of it. If you know anyone who was in high school or junior high at this time, they'll talk about the police department drove this really cool car to school, and it was so cool looking. It was a Bricklin. There was some problems with it. You see, like most cars in Arizona, batteries don't last that long, especially when it's doing all the work of opening these doors up every time you want it to go in and out. And you can actually see if there's a police retiree group that has pictures, and they have it on a Facebook group, and they will talk about this car and they will laugh about it. And some people are like, oh, I can't stand that Bricklin. It was a terrible car. So I asked, when I was like, what was the problem? I said, you arrest somebody, where are you going to put them? There's no back seat. And I asked one of the officers, I said, was this the year the Scottsdale Police Department put the criminals on the roof of the car? They said, no, that didn't happen, Bruce. I said, did they buy the car or they leased the car? And they were able to show me this as a memo saying there's $1 per vehicle for a 1-year lease for 3 cars. And this is one of my favorite photos of the Bricklin. I like to use it. So Marcy Breen on the left. She's officer badge number 246, and Officer Don Reardon at the right, he's badge number 134. Don has been to several of these classes. He likes to come to the criminal classes with his friend, blanked on his name, Dennis Borkenhagen. They come to the classes, and he's about 6 feet tall. Look how high his leg is up to put it on the bottom of the car. So you're like lying down flat and you're trying to get out. So you're driving the police car like this, and you want to do a traffic stop and you want to get out. Now you almost have to lift your legs out to get out of this thing if the battery doesn't fail and the door does open up. But if it does, it opens like this. So you want to get out and be a police officer and do this, and you got to sit there and wait for the door to open. And then you got to lift your leg up, and the officers have all that weight on around their waist. So it's a little bit harder, especially the doors weighed 90 pounds. So if they did get stuck, they couldn't push them up with just their upper body. Or there were, let's just say there were some officers who did not have the upper body strength to push that up. One of the officers got stuck in the car while they were at the station, and of course all the other officers made fun, and then finally let her out. And another one, his car, the battery died, and he rolled into a gas station, and the tech came out to help him, thought he wanted to pump some gas, and he's waving like, no, open the door, I can't get out. The attendee's laughing so hard, he won't stop laughing. So the officer has to pretend to call on the radio to arrest the guy if he doesn't get him out. That's when the guy finally lifted the door and let him out. The final straw for the patrol officers was a lieutenant from Tempe, and he let him drive the car, and they're driving through, and the car started on fire. And they actually got to go to a rural metro station. They put out the fire, and at that point, patrol said, no more. It's not going on to not going to be patrol anymore. And all the school resource officers got it as to go to the schools. And that's why so many of the students of this time of 1975 have these wonderful memories of the Brooklyn police car. That's to show you how high up it was to get your foot out of it while you're lying down. It was a challenge. Now there's 3 police cars. You see, here's this memo talking about the 3 cars that Captain Gannon has advised me, blah, blah, blah. And you see 3 numbers of three numbers, 588, 406, and I think it's 593. Those were the last 3 of the VIN numbers. And that one 588 is going to play a little part, because after the police department it sold and sold and sold and sold and sold and went around all over places. It was found in Manitoba, Canada, in a farmer's field, and just sitting there. And they looked at it, and there was number 588. And this guy who was a police car collector who liked to research and find famous police cars finds this, buys the car, and brings it back to New York. And he starts several years of restoration work. So this is what it looked like when he got it. And when he was done, it looked like this. Several years. He said the hardest thing in the entire car to get back, the gumball on top. He said he has no idea. It's called a Whelan Model 5000. And it's also, you see, it's a speaker system, a public address system, and the lights and siren. He said it was almost impossible, but he finally restored it. So here it is again, here's the original picture, and here's a picture of Kerry Stark, who restored the car at a car show for police cars in New York. Now, Kerry Stark is on that Facebook group, and I've seen him make comments and things, and I know he's in contact with Officer Pulaski, who restored a Plymouth. It took him several years to do that, but we now have this Plymouth that was the same as what we used to have, I think, back in the early 60s, that you can now see. But this is the original Scottsdale police car, VIN number 588, restored to look like it did back in 1975. Now, Bricklin was not finished. He made 3,000 cars, and then he got out of the car business and he started to import cars. Instead of manufacturing them, he import them. And he found a car that it was like the cheapest car ever for him to buy, and he could turn around and sell it for quite a good profit. It was amazing, the genius of this man. From 1985 to 1992, he imported the Yugo. Now I'm being a little sarcastic there. The Yugo, made in Yugoslavia, is considered the worst car ever, bar none, ever sold in the United States. It broke down more often. It had absolutely no reliability, but it did make him quite a bit of money. He's still apparently importing and selling cars. He's still alive. Apparently he still lives in Scottsdale. At least he did pre-pandemic. So let's talk about some Scottsdale police merch that you probably need. How about the t-shirt that says, "Our police car is cooler than yours, Scottsdale Police." Or, of course, the mug that says, "When the police put the criminal on the roof." Are there any questions about the Bricklin? Yeah. Oh, the question was, it looked like a Pennsylvania license plate. You're absolutely right. I said New York. I think I have Winfield Scott on the brain from New York. It was Pennsylvania. You're right. Yeah. You're absolutely correct. Yeah.
So I remember that. But my question is, are they able to, when they restore old police vehicles, are they allowed to put the city seal on?
The question is, when they restore a police vehicle, are they allowed to put the city seal on the side? Most police cars that are restored by the city that they did it. I don't know what Kerry Stark did, but I'm sure he had some sort of permission. I also know that the city does trademark its seal and trademark the city logo, but I've also seen it on websites, and I know it's been used by other people for other things. Anything virtual? Yes, Amy. The question is, did the Yugo have more horsepower than the Subaru? I bet it did. It just didn't last that long. Anything else? Well, if you guys could take a minute and fill out your evaluations, the sources for this, here's all the books. I'll leave this up for a second if someone wants to take a picture of the books that I use to find this, or the different sources of where I got some of this stuff. Some of the books by Joan Fadala, 100 Years of the Cavaliers, Scottsdale Jewel of the Desert by Patricia Myers McElfresh, Scottsdale Memories, The Reminiscences of Paul Messenger, The Fastball Tunnel by John Hammond Moore, The Great Desert Escape by Keith Warren Lloyd, and Winfield Scott by Richard Lynch. These are some of the people who helped me with this presentation. I've been doing this now since 2018, and it's sad that some of these people have retired already. They shouldn't retire before me. Just wrong. And some other people, and some of them changed departments. Thank you so much for coming to Scottsdale Neighborhood College. Hope you enjoyed the presentation of Scottsdale Behind the Photos as much as I did presenting it to you. I love this presentation. So this is the end for now, until 2 weeks for a new presentation, and next fall will be a brand new presentation. Thank you all very much for coming.